Hello, and welcome back to the 16th installment in a series of videos about the history of Japanese prints and the collection of Japanese works on paper at the Honolulu Museum of Art. I'm Stephen Salel, the curator of Japanese art. In our previous video, we discussed the prints of Utagawa Kuniyoshi, best known for his portraits of warriors and his supernatural imagery. Kuniyoshi died in 1861, and in two of his last prints, he documented a phenomenon that would radically alter the historical trajectory of Japan: commercial interaction with foreigners. In 1635, in order to politically unify the Japanese archipelago and eliminate the influence of other nations, Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu forbade Japanese citizens from leaving the country. He outlawed the practice of Christianity, and he restricted trade to Chinese, Dutch, and Korean merchants at a limited number of ports in Nagasaki. This policy of isolationism continued until 1854, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy anchored his ships off the coast of Kanagawa. After a series of negotiations with Japanese leaders, Perry required all of the country's ports to welcome international trade. Soon thereafter, the feudal military government that ruled Japan for more than 250 years was replaced with a constitutional monarchy. This relatively peaceful political revolution was known as the Meiji Restoration. The following 46 years, which we call the Meiji era, witnessed dramatic changes in the country's technology, its pictorial aesthetics, and the subject matter of woodblock prints. One immediate effect that the importation of Western technology had upon Japanese prints was the way in which the country's landscape, so recently immortalized in works by Hokusai and Hiroshige, began to transform. Telegraph lines and the poles that supported them add an unusual sense of urbanization to these scenes. In the capital of Edo, renamed Tokyo at this time, new architectural structures and modes of transportation became emblems of Japan's commitment to modernization. The Takahashi Bridge, constructed around 1881 to span the Sumida River, was an iron foil truss bridge resembling several others constructed throughout the United States. In 1868, the Scottish merchant Thomas Blake Glover brought the first steam locomotive to Japan. 4 years later, the first railway began operation, transporting passengers between Shimbashi Station and the nearby city of Yokohama. Excitement about this achievement was so great that print designers such as Utagawa Yoshitora published depictions of the train before its construction had even finished. One of the technological developments that most dramatically impacted the work of woodblock print designers was the importation of synthetic pigments. As discussed in a previous video, ferrous ferrocyanide, commonly known as Prussian blue, became available to printmakers back in the 1830s and is best known from Hokusai's series 36 Views of Mount Fuji. With international trade no longer restricted, a wide spectrum of aniline dyes was introduced to Japan from the 1860s through the 1890s. Not only were these pigments resilient and resistant to fading, even when exposed to ultraviolet light, their intensity was unlike anything designers had previously imagined. And they brought to woodblock prints a sense of visual spectacle that in many ways suited such subjects as kabuki theater. What designers lost with the utilization of these pigments, however, was the ability to mix them in a way that resulted in naturalistic depictions of three-dimensional space. As a result, many prints from this time period are distinguished not only by their brilliance, but by a sense of decorative flatness. Although the term decorative flatness may bring to mind the sumptuously fluid compositions of early designers such as Hishikawa Morinobu, the intensity of the colors used here made subtleties in the line work of the print difficult to notice. And even with the intense use of one-point perspective, images from this time lost the sense of pictorial depth that distinguished prints from the early 19th century. Perhaps the technology that had the greatest impact upon the medium of woodblock printmaking was photography. The first camera was imported to Nagasaki by Dutch traders in 1848, and the earliest Japanese daguerreotypes can be dated to the following year. A pioneer of Japanese photography was the Italian-British Felix Beato, who, from 1864 through 1867, operated a photography studio in Yokohama with his British friend Charles Wergman. In Beato's and Wergman's wake, a number of important Japanese photographers produced stunning works in black and white, many of which were later hand-colored with aniline dyes. Kusakabe Kimbe was a particularly well-remembered pioneer of the medium. But sadly, the names of many of his equally talented contemporaries have been forgotten. Largely due to the popularity of photographs, the aesthetics of woodblock prints quickly evolved as well, and the degree of realism that designers incorporated into their prints during this era is clearly visible in the works themselves. One particular visual phenomena that several of these artists focused upon was the silhouette. The proliferation of artificial lighting, either from gas or electricity, throughout Japanese cities seems to have been one of the reasons for this sudden interest in stark tonal contrasts, which occurs much less frequently in situations of natural lighting. In addition to these changes in the technology and aesthetics of woodblock prints, the Meiji era witnessed a new function for prints: to report current events, the most dramatic of which was the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. like contemporary news photographers embedded in military units. Woodblock print designers accompanied soldiers to the front lines, sketched the events they witnessed, and produced colorful woodblock prints over the following days. Though arising in many ways from the genre of warrior prints, rather than those of historical and mythical tales, the immediate social relevance of these artworks infused them with a distinctly different meaning. They functioned as war propaganda. And these images of Japanese soldiers risking their lives for the sake of their country undeniably helped to secure public support for the Meiji government's decision to invade China. A far less recognized social change at this time that Japanese prints documented and, to some extent, promoted was the development of women's civil rights. In the late 19th century, when the Meiji government established the Ministry of Education and made primary school compulsory for both boys and girls, the literacy rate for women rose dramatically. So too did the demand for books and magazines that catered primarily to a female audience. This led to the appearance of serialized stories, mostly romances, in journals such as Literary Club, or in Japanese, Bunge Kurabu. The bulk of these publications were printed with mechanical type and included monochromatic, mechanically printed illustrations, but in order to appeal to readers who enjoyed the craftsmanship of woodblock printed books from the Edo period, publishers included a woodblock printed frontispiece, known in Japanese as a kuchie. The frontispiece was often a large image that was folded once or twice in order to fit inside the magazine. The imagery in these kuchie reflected changing attitudes about gender during this time. A portrait of a woman wearing eyeglasses, for example, implied that she was literate and enjoyed reading. In the late 1910s through the 1920s, Japanese women who sported Western hairstyles, particularly a bobbed haircut, were referred to as modern girls, simplified in Japanese as the portmanteau moga, and known in the United States as flappers. These prints document the gradual popularization of Western haircuts and fashion among Japanese women. At the time, female students in high school and college began to wear hakama, pleated trousers that had been worn exclusively by men, at least since the 12th century. In our previous video, we discussed how Utagawa Kuniyoshi produced several portraits of valiant women throughout Japanese history. During the Meiji period, several other artists, such as the kuchie designer Takeuchi Keishu, explored this subject as well. During the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, rumors about a battalion of female soldiers were reported in Japanese newspapers. And though the veracity of such stories is doubtful, they inspired the imagination of several print designers, including Utagawa Yoshitora and Tsukioka Yoshitoshi. Equally intriguing images by print designers at this time include portraits of female artists working in their studios. And on the heels of Utagawa Kuniyoshi's female students, we find at this time a few more women who enjoyed commercial success as woodblock print designers and who left remarkably enduring art historical footprints. Most notable was Ikeda Shoen, who produced Nihonga paintings and designed woodblock prints, including Kuchie, during the 1910s. Her paintings were included in the 1907 Japanese Art Academy exhibition sponsored by the Ministry of Education. Several of her prints are also currently preserved in museums throughout the world. In our next video, we will discuss the prints of Onshi Koshiro and one of the ways in which woodblock print artists continued to work when the art historical movement known as ukiyo-e finally came to an end.